Good afternoon, everyone in Augusta, Georgia.
I think Val is going to say something.
Okay. No, you are good to go, sir.
Thanks, Val. Good afternoon, everyone in Augusta, Georgia and the Americas. And for anyone who is still up late in Europe, my name's Peter Deans. I'm coming to you from Sydney in Australia, and I've got a couple of my Australian colleagues on the panel here today, as well as Andrea Bonime-Blanc, who we'll call an honorary Australian for this session. It's great to be back here. This is the second year we've done what last year we coined an Australian cybersecurity hour. This year we're going to lift it up a little bit and talk more broadly around technology risk. I'll first just introduce the panelists and then get into the topic myself. My name's Peter Deans. I've been involved in the Cyber Future Foundation for a number of years now. I'm a former Chief Risk Officer and now spend my time doing a range of non-exec director board roles, as well as risk and strategy advisory work, and a very, very keen interest in cybersecurity and risk management more broadly. I'll just hand over to each of the panelists first. Charlotte Middleton, just a short introduction.
Good afternoon all, or good morning on our side. So I'm a current Chief Risk Officer. I'm at a non-bank financial company called Scotback, but previously all my career has been in banking and the last decade or so in risk. So I've done a few Chief Risk Officer roles, including a neobank, which was interesting. So really my interest in cyber is one of the most significant non-financial risks we're facing. How do we stay a step ahead? How do we improve our board reporting? All of the things we'll talk about today, and great to be on this panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlotte. Jason Millett.
Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone in the US. Jason Millett. Look, I'm a long-term technologist. I've had various roles as chief information officers of banks and divisions within banks. Currently, I sit on 4 fintech boards. One of them is actually an embedded finance organisation, where actually the whole concept of security and cyber is fundamental, especially when you're delivering services into that. I've been on both sides of security success, where having to do turnarounds and actually uplift security capabilities, and also sitting on the board being informed around how security is fundamental. I've worked with Peter previously at one of our banks in Australia, and Peter absolutely embedded in my mindset that risk is everyone's business, but cyber is everyone's focus. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And then back into the North American time zone, Andrea, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and good morning to my Australian co-panelists, and good afternoon to everybody else. So I started life as a lawyer, became a general counsel, and then expanded my wings into several other roles, including Chief Risk Officer, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, took care of a variety of what we call ESG issues nowadays for 4 different companies as an executive. And the last one was a technology company where they also threw in, for good measure, my overseeing the information security function, which was my deep dive. That was about 10, 11 years ago. And I kind of learned what it meant to do information security from an executive standpoint. And since then, I've had my own business doing strategic ESG plus cyber and technology advisory to businesses, to nonprofits and government agencies. I teach cyber leadership, risk oversight, and resilience at NYU at a master's in global affairs there. And I write about this subject a lot. I've written a book that kind of brings together the ESG concepts with the T, technology concepts, and cyber to me is a really big portion of that. And I also serve on a few boards and advise boards. So I kind of have the 360 on the board piece that I like to talk about and rail about once in a while too.
It's good to have some evangelists around, isn't it, Andrea? Well, thanks for the introduction, and we might get into it. I will just continue with just a little bit more of an Australian flavour here, just to provide a bit of context. For those that perhaps haven't had the good fortune to come and visit the country and understand the business environment here, we are, again, quite an advanced and sophisticated, technology-based country now. I think, as many of the cyber specialists will know, that Australia is one of the Five Eyes in the intelligence community. And even with a little bit of a history lesson, what people probably won't be aware is Australia actually was the source of quite a number of innovations that are known well today. The government-owned scientific agency, CISRO, it was one of the leaders in the development of wireless LAN technology. Google Maps, which is almost indispensable, was actually developed by four engineers in Sydney in the early 90s. More recently, quite a number of well-known names have emerged. Atlassian, Afterpay, the buy now, pay later market leader, and most recently Canva have all come out of the very, very dynamic technology ecosystem in Australia. From a board governance perspective, likewise, the listed corporations here and the industry bodies have actually led a lot of what's seen as modern governance around board governance and oversight. I think it's interesting just with the topic itself. There's a long history of particularly larger public companies and larger corporations having a number of board subsidiaries, such as a risk committee or a HR and nominations or people committee, obviously audit committees. I'm just interested to explore whether we sort of still see enough technology committees. And I know it's cliched that every business is a technology business today, but probably just the question to kick off with is, how involved are boards getting today in technology? Or is it still well down the agenda and effectively running out of time at each board meeting? I mean, Andrea, I might just start with you. Just give us a little bit of a stock take of what good governance today looks like and what we're seeing.
Sure thing. So what I'm seeing is boards are not fully equipped yet. In fact, they're still lagging quite substantially, generally speaking. I would say some of the tech companies and the companies that are at the cutting edge of digital transformation, they are probably in the best place. But some of the more traditional businesses who don't think of themselves as technology businesses, going back to your cliche, every business is a digital or technology business at this point, and it's true. And so I think there's a woeful absence of people with great expertise in technology, digital, cyber, kinds of expertises at the board level. And I think it goes back to a more fundamental problem that we have in governance generally. And, I'll speak mostly, I can't speak for Australia, but I can speak for some of the US and some of the European global multinationals and smaller, medium-sized businesses. They just don't have the diversity on board, literally, that brings that technology expertise or experience. And I think there's just too much of the old boys network still going on, where it's mainly CEOs and CFOs, ex-CEOs, ex-CFOs. It's sort of a clubby environment. A few women have snuck into the boardroom recently, and then you have a few people of color also in the US. I think that we are starting to break the ice on this, and that you're starting to see people with diverse experience backgrounds, which includes risk officers, ethics, compliance kinds of people with technology and cyber expertise. But there's not enough conscientious sort of deliberate effort to do this. But I do think that there's the silver lining of this terrible period we're going through, coming hopefully out of with the pandemic, where all these issues that the boards traditionally are not equipped to deal with, the ESG issues, the technology, the ransomware, all these big issues that have converged all at once, have really heightened sort of the question, do we have the right people on the board? And should we be recruiting a little differently than we used to? And that will include people, more diverse people too, who aren't just CEOs and CFOs and men who've been in a certain club for years. No insults intended to the men in this on this panel, but at the end of the day, I think the diversity piece really speaks to greater profitability, better risk management. We all have seen these studies. So we need to see a more balance still on these boards, but I see light at the end of the tunnel.
Great points, Andrea. Jason, over to you. I mean, I think Andrea's just touched on, I guess, the skills mix and good governance these days. We do see, formal skills mix being published. I suspect there's a fair bit of everyone's a technology expert, even though they may not perhaps have the currency of that. What's your perspective on that sort of getting that right mix on the board?
Yeah, look, it's very important. when you think of the amount of money that's being spent by organisations, corporates on technology, the major banks in Australia are all spending $1 billion plus every year on maintaining legacy environments, on doing things to just actually keep competitive. They're being constantly challenged by emerging businesses, neobanks, innovative fintechs, etc. And so that mix on the board, not necessarily, and Andrea, I don't think that companies are necessarily tech companies. I think that's a position. I think they're actually enabled by technology, and it's about understanding how that enablement comes together, because the three-legged stool of people, process and technology is absolutely valid. You can never have a long suit on any of those, because unless they're nicely balanced, the organisation actually doesn't work. I agree with your point on diversity, and we're working really hard in this jurisdiction to improve the representation of diversity, and moving away from that traditional CFO, CEO with a finance background, and trying to get more risk officers, more technologists, more business people. I do feel sorry for the marketers, because everyone's an expert on marketing, and they never seem to get a run. But it's important that those skills do come to the fore. Technology is being really brought front of mind, because for a lot of organisations to stay competitive, to be efficient, to enable their business plans, they need to embrace the opportunities that technology brings to them as an enabler. They don't necessarily need to be experts, but they also need to appreciate that they don't know everything as an owner of an iPhone. I think what we're seeing emerge in the Australian marketplace is not necessarily the formalisation of experts coming into the board, but the boards drawing on advisories to come in and give them insights and considerations on things that are not the reason that those individuals are on the board. So we're at an important point. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see a more informed board member, a more rounded board member who has experience that actually adds value, not just to the shareholder, but also to the customer, which is fundamental to the shareholder being successful.
Thanks, Jason. Andrea touched on, I guess, the challenges of boards starting to think about ESG, which is, of course, a very much more holistic approach to stakeholder management. Charlotte, you're the non-IT, non-technical person in the room for this discussion, and Absolutely. The CRO role sort of emerged to become very much a generalist. I mean, what's your perspective again on how, whether it's executives or board members, can tackle this sort of demystifying technology, understand technology risks, perhaps from a non-IT background?
Sure. Well, I think increasingly CROs need to work with CTOs or CISOs, or whichever is the key role in the organisation around IT security, and I find that really helpful to have those pre-board meetings to ask the stupid questions, to ensure that the presentation is in plain English, or at least is well understood, because I sort of think, well, I'm the dry run here. If I'm not understanding what you're getting at, then I don't feel our board will. So I think that's important, and I think frequency of discussion with the board is important. So if there is like a strategic uplift program, you can't just present that annually. I think it's that quarterly update, or whatever deemed the most relevant. But if you're having that sort of ongoing education piece almost, then the boards will really start to understand. And finally, the other thing is to bring in sometimes an external educator or expert that's really good at this. And so the gravitas of why it's important to get this right. Yes, the CTO can do that, or the CRO, but having someone external can also really help at times.
Charlotte, you mentioned earlier on, and I know you were involved last year in a neobank here in Australia that had started up less than a year before that. I mean, is there a need to essentially treat every discussion and every management committee as a technology committee in that sort of environment? I think some of us are still a bit structured of like, well, that's the audit committee, that's the risk committee, that's the IT committee. Is this too structured a way to think of it when you're looking at, what 100% technology businesses?
Yes, actually that neobank I was at was very technology driven. So it was a great learning for me in that technology did permeate a lot of the discussions. So it was a lot, I guess more modern in that sense. So I think you're right, Peter. I think, having that lens within more than just the technology committee discussion probably
maybe
becomes
Andrea,
pretty
that's a good one to get your comment on. I mean, is our thinking too structured, perhaps anchored in governance of a different era?
Totally. I actually think the governance structures that we typically have, certainly in the US and some of the global multinationals that I'm familiar with, they go with the 3 standing committees, and then maybe they go with one more. And the problem with that is something like cyber or technology or risk ends up in the audit committee, which is already overburdened with all kinds of other things. And is really backward looking rather than forward looking. So, I counsel boards and others to think about, if you don't do a separate committee that is more of a sort of a digital transformation or risk and strategy, something that is not just looking at the risks, but looking at the future. Looking around the corners, bringing in the CRO to give reports not only on the enterprise risk management results, including cyber, but what are you seeing around the corner? What is coming at us? What are some of the new risks that we should be thinking about? A lot of them have to do with the digitization of business and technology, et cetera, depending on what business you're in. And so I think saying, you have to have a technology committee or subcommittee is spurious. I think you have to look at each business as a standalone, also look at the sector and what best practices might be in the sector. But I keep counseling businesses to think about themselves as a custom situation. Yes, you have to have the standard standing committees, but what is your business footprint? What is your geography? What are your people issues and products and services? And then design something that makes sense for you. For example, going back to the ESG issue, this is now the big thing, certainly in the US. I know that Europeans have been quite a bit ahead of us. Australians, I'm not sure. I leave that to you to judge. But the ESG thing is now waking up every board, especially because of the pandemic issues that have arisen. And cyber is one of the big ones, obviously, with ransomware attacks and what have you. But it's basically everybody's saying, what should we do about ESG? Should we be creating an ESG committee, or should we be parceling out different things to the standing committees? So again, I go back to saying, what is your business footprint? What are your needs? What's your strategy? Who are your people? And then start designing something that makes sense for you. And last but not least, I will say that I think it's useful to think of ESG, cyber technology issues as a portfolio of non-financial, intangible issues, risks, opportunities that can affect your strategy in a good way and potentially in a bad way. So I favor sort of a holistic approach to that. Where that fits in a boardroom, I think people have to make that decision.
Great point. I've got a question for later on, a little bit about the non-financial risks or the non-cyber IT non-financial risks, which we'll come to. Jason, just a bit on that what's the right rhythm for overseeing technology risks? You're on, I think, a number of smaller organizations. What does good look like with those smaller tech companies from a tech oversight perspective?
Yeah, look, I echo Charlotte's comments. It's the fintech boards I sit on are quite tech heavy, but what we try to do is we go back to my original comment that technology is but the enabler, and when you're in startup mode, actually having a minimal viable product or a value proposition that is coherent and real, and you are generating revenue on platform, and that platform is sustainable and working. That's the technology component part of it. But actually talking to investors and talking to sourcing funding. I mean, you can have the ideas of the best technology on the planet, but if you can't fund the pathway to actually realise that technology in a way that is enabling the business to be successful and driving your financial outcomes, it tends to be a little bit a bit of a moot point. What we try to do, and one particular board in particular, we're very, very structured on the component parts. So we have a regular report from the CRO, a regular report from the CIO, from the CFO, etc. And we've got sufficient diversity on the board itself from the independent non-executive directors to really sort of process that information and have a meaningful conversation that is geared towards what are the capabilities that each of those functional elements need to bring to bear to realise our strategic outcomes or our strategic intent. And I think both Andrea and Charlotte, made the point. Look, it's all about the strategy, and it's all about where you want to take the business and how you bring to bear all of the resources and the funding that you have, and the technology components and the risk appetite and the frameworks that you're applying and the marketplaces that you're going after in order to be successful in realising that strategy. And the cadence, again, we do that on a monthly basis. We've had we had a safe harbour issue where we were running out of money, and the board was meeting on a daily basis to make sure that the money was coming through and that we were able to be, meet our obligations to be solvent and pay our debts. And that was while running a technology stack that was fundamental to what we've now been able to do. So the cadence will really depend on the circumstance. But I think if you're not as a board member thinking about the component parts of your accountability, which are around risk, around business, around tech, around people, on at least a monthly basis, then perhaps you're not doing the right thing by your investors and by your shareholders. And you're certainly not doing the right thing by the management. The other thing that I think boards have to be very careful of is that they are the board, not the management. And this is the point around bringing in experts to come and advise the board, but to just advise the board with those experts is I think self-serving for the board. I think those experts actually need to have combined sessions with management and board so that actually the tide rises and all the boats rise with the tide, so that capability that your organisation has and continues to develop gives you that foundation that you can then continue to grow from.
It's a really good point you've raised just about the line between board and management, and we do actually have sort of effectively regional differences. If we get some time at the end, we might come back to that, because governance between board and executive management in the US is very different to Europe, very different to Australia. There's quite subtle differences that come out in reality. Charlotte, just on the point about working with the CIO you raised earlier, and a little bit of, in terms of developing the risk frameworks and the governance for the oversight of technology risk, that obviously must be a fairly pivotal relationship. What's your experience there?
Yes, agreed. And it really is evolving, and that interaction I see, really has increased over the last couple of years. And back to the point on the engagement and the planning side, I think it's key. I think it will always, from my perspective, or maybe I'm less technology driven than some CROs. So I find it works best if it is still led by the CTO, CIO. However, I feel I can be of great support as well in that discussion, in that, if the CRO is also expressing that I feel this is the key risk and why I'm fully backing the investment proposal, then I think I can, be of benefit here. So that working together piece, the planning ahead of time, for me is extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of larger financial institutions, what we call the first line, the IT area, they've actually got quite large departments doing just IT governance now. So I think it's really just a matter of that fit for purpose, depending on the size of the organisation. Let's move on to cyber and the risks themselves. And, cyber in all of the surveys, board directors and the World Economic Forum, it's 1, 2, or 3. I think pandemic knocked it down a little bit, but I suspect it's moving back up. In terms of oversight of technology risk, is there too much, and Val's probably not going to be happy if I say this, but is there too much emphasis on cyber and perhaps to the detriment of more general project risks, perhaps business continuity, and we see, a lot of outages of large businesses that have nothing to do with cyber, but are technology failures. Have we got the balance right? Maybe Andrea, I might just start with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always look at the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report, as all of us do, I'm sure, every year when it comes out. And it's a great resource, but it's always backward looking. So, 2 years ago, the top risk was the top 5 risks for likelihood, I think, were climate. And then last year, it was this year, 2021, it was pandemic, of course, the number 1 risk, right? That's we knew that already. But I also follow the Allianz Risk Barometer, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well. And they did something very interesting this year. Again, it's backward looking, but it's interesting. They, instead of, cyber being number 1, which it was last year before the pandemic, I'm always getting confused here, 2020. This year, they have what they called the COVID trio. The top 3 risks were business interruption, cyber, and pandemic. And they were talking about how they're interconnected risks and how they kind of egged each other on. And, they all bubbled to the top of the surface of most important business risks because each one caused the other in some way or another, had a correlation with the other. And cyber was still in play, clearly, because cyber became huge last year with the ransomware and the distribution of workforce and what have you. So I think it's really important that we look at that, but that we also have a very proactive, and this is where I think the board expertise is so important, because we want to have people on boards who know what questions to ask. They may not be the cyber experts, but they're the chief risk officers or the, somebody who's been a CISO in a big company and can see transversely at how things are done, enterprise risk management, strategy, and things like that. Having those kinds of people who can see transversely, but they've had the deep experience of being the CRO or the CIO or the CISO, those people can ask the questions that the CFO and the CEO may not be thinking about. And general counsels, I think, I'll just plug my previous role. I think lawyers who are, again, transversal in their thinking, not just legal, can also be people who question a lot of these things. So I think we need to look at the data coming up to this time, but also try to be thoughtful about what's coming around the corner and have a team inside the company that is not just the CRO, but maybe PR and comms, maybe a couple of other sort of key people who are looking at the issues in the marketplace, are looking at situational awareness on environmental, on social, on governance, and so on, and are seeing the things that are percolating that could become a risk or even an opportunity. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thanks, Andrea. I mean, Jason, I know from our collective time in the banking industry, the customers don't really care whether it's a cyber attack or an IT outage. They just want to pay for their groceries or get their money out of the bank. And again, I just wonder if there's there isn't this sufficient focus on business continuity, because I think every day and every week we do see general outages. Is there a bit of a blind spot here, do you think, Jason?
Yeah, look, my view on cyber, and when I advise folks on this, it's not about being the best cyber security organisation on the planet. It's just about not being in the bottom 20% or 30%. So it's a bit like when you're being chased by a tiger, don't be the slowest. You want to be ahead of that. So that then informs, and this is where you work very closely with the chief risk officer, and the executive committee around your risk appetite and what you are willing to actually forego in the need to give you a posture from a cyber perspective that protects your estate. It's an interesting thing that you could spend on cyber until you run out of money. That won't help your resilience from a business continuity perspective. It'll certainly protect your crown of jewels, your data, and protect your environments. But you want to be doing enough to make sure that you're not vulnerable to denial of service attacks, that you're not vulnerable to data breaches. You want to be doing enough education to ensure that the weakest link typically is the employee, that they're not being spearphished. They're not having their passwords taken. They're not providing access into your perimeter, into your estate, to give bad actors, bad players, people that want to do harm, the opportunity to actually do that harm. But it's got to be balanced. So when you're looking, certainly the IT metrics and scorecards that I've used as a CIO are a balance of the performance of the estate in delivering that capability to support the business, as well as the ability to detect threats, the ability to deal with those threats, the constant issue of making sure that your servers are patched, or your firewalls are up to date. A little less of an issue now that that services are being consumed by cloud providers, but making sure that your applications are actually able to run effectively in those environments. So it is a balancing act, but I think it's a balancing act that the CIO, CTO needs to have that hard conversation and be guided by the chief risk officer, by the chief revenue officer, by the CEO, to ensure that what capability is being supported in technology to support the estate from a cyber perspective is balanced against the things that are going to allow the company to actually continue to grow and continue to perform.
Sorry, I was just going to say that point about being balanced is a really important one, and I think trying to actually get it operationalized is the real challenge. I mean, Charlotte and I were talking earlier today. Our local regulator, ASIC, launched a lawsuit against a listed company for a cybersecurity incident and failing to have adequate controls in place. And I do wonder if we'll start to see more and more litigation. And Andrea, you're the lawyer in the room, so we'll come back to you on this as well. But Charlotte, how do you sort of sell the message whilst not necessarily being alarmist when you've actually got a lot of real life examples out there you can point to that this is the downside for us, but as Jason said, quite often it gets lost in a bit of the fog of we can't do everything, we can't spend too much money. What is the middle ground? How best to communicate these downside risks?
That's right. Well, I do think it's an inexact science, but I question the CIO around this. Okay, if we only are able to spend half the amount you're looking for, what are the must-do things of your list of 15 things? What's the prioritization and what's the argument for each of them? If we aren't able to spend, what are the risks we're facing into? So again, it's for me, it's just exploring that. But I do think it's an inexact science. I think Jason expressed it well around you could spend and spend and spend, but that there probably are choices to be made, and then getting the risk appetite right was mentioned as well. So that's a key focus also. Yeah,
we might finish off just with risk appetite and reporting. Andrea, just again, that sort of do you feel that boards are sufficiently across the inherent risk and the downside risk, particularly from a litigation and reputation perspective, of not getting technology risk right?
I would say they probably are more attuned to that than to the upside of building resilience and being preventative. The U.S. is a very litigious society. We have lawsuits for all kinds of things. And there are starting to be pressures against companies. Certainly some of the big cyber breaches, there have been lawsuits, there have been regulatory interventions. Now there's starting to be a much more proactive, let's have a government, private sector collaborative approach to cybersecurity, because clearly companies, even the big infrastructure and the big multinational companies, can't do this by themselves. And they haven't. I mean, they've had collaboration with the government for a while, but there haven't been the right incentive structures put into place, both from a carrot and a stick standpoint, I think, in terms of if you build the resilience necessary, whatever that means, and I think that's where the nub of the matter is, then maybe you will be, protected from the worst kind of litigation or shareholder derivative suits, or the boards as well, for that matter, if they're not being responsible, duty of care, other kinds of duties at the board level. So I like to use an analogy that in my days of an ethics and compliance officer was really the way that we looked at things. If you build an effective ethics and compliance program internally at your company, meaning all the things that we're talking about with cyber, training, processes, controls, auditing, monitoring, reporting up to the board, reporting up to executives, cross-disciplinary, all those things that make an organization more resilient. And I really think I wrote a piece a few years ago about this for a chapter for a book, using that analogy of an effective ethics and compliance. How about an effective cyber resilience program, which includes all the things we talked about a moment ago, the business continuity, data backup, crisis management plans, having all that in place. And so I think that's going to be the next step. And our SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, is starting to look at some of that. In fact, they put out a paper a couple of years ago about, here's some guidelines on what you should be doing. And it's exactly the same as this sort of resilience, ethics, and compliance in the cyberspace. And I think there'll be some reporting that's going to be based on that as well. I co-wrote another piece last year with a Swiss friend of mine, a Swiss Re friend of mine, and we were talking about, is there going to be a cyber piece to ESG reporting at some point? And I think we all need to get prepared for that. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. No,
I think really good points, and perhaps it is a bit of regulatory pressure as well as guidance that brings this to the fore. But Australia is just moving into a phase where there'll be mandatory reporting of cyber breaches for corporations, which perhaps a little bit more red tape, but I think it's probably necessary in this age. We might just finish off with a couple more minutes to go, just on the balance in getting reporting right. Perhaps, Jason, you touched on a little bit earlier on about the reporting you see in the firms you're involved in. Again, just a minute or so on what good looks like there.
Yeah, look. What I'd like to try and do is move the board away from unconscious incompetence to conscious competence. And that is through a way of making sure that they have sufficient granularity, because there are some great frameworks out there, SOC 2, ISO 27001, etc., that actually inform where people need to think, not how they need to think, but where they need to think. And then you rely on management to come up with the necessary reporting to demonstrate that compliance and oversight is able to be achieved in those areas. If as a board you make a call not to make an investment, make sure you understand why you've made that call, and make sure it's well documented, because the next time money comes around and that risk, if that risk has moved, you want to try and mitigate it. So it's that constant revisiting. And again, this is really dynamic. The whole cyber risk piece is constantly moving. And so the board has got to be prepared through reporting to be able to see that movement and then be able to respond appropriately to it.
Thanks, Jason. And Charlotte, your thoughts, and I probably have a bit of a question around efficiency in reporting as well. Should it be the same reporting pack that goes to the executive team for IT risks more generally as what goes to the board, or does the boards want to see a bit less? Do you have a view on on how to be efficient and what should be in there, particularly again picking up risk appetite and reporting against risk appetite?
Yeah, I think it is evolving. I think we should just keep asking ourselves that same question, actually ask our board members and get feedback on, is it working from their side? So yeah, it's probably something I want to spend a bit more time on. But yeah, I do come back to the risk appetite, and if we can get some of those metrics right, I think that does really help inform the board. It is broader than that, but yeah, I think more work to be done, certainly on my side, to get that to a better state. Yep.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm always very hesitant to give a former lawyer the last word here, but you're in luck.
Accent on former.
Maybe just to finish off on that point, we touched on about the line between board and management when it comes to reporting and oversight of technology risks, and we will finish there with less than a minute to go.
Yeah, so I actually loved what Jason shared with us a few minutes ago about his boards and how he's seeing much more hands-on, or at least activity. And maybe it's because they're in the earlier stages, they're startups, and that is more typical. But I really think we're reaching a new era in governance because of all the things that are happening, sort of all the convergence of risks and opportunities. And I think where we are going is a model of governance. You know, here in the US, I don't know if you use this expression in Australia, but we have this expression in governance, boards, noses in, fingers out. And I came up with a little limerick the other day when I was talking to a similar group. I said, how about brains in, hands available? Because I think that we're in a situation now where we need all hands on deck in the sense of people's brain power helping. And the cyber issue is one of the most transversal and difficult ones. And so I'd say let's have some of the right people at the table, both at the board level, management level, and let's not create bureaucratic structures to solve problems.
Fantastic note to finish on. Look, with that, we'll finish up. I think it's been a great session. So, Andrea, Charlotte, and Jason, thank you very much for your contribution. Val, we'll hand it back over to you and have a great week.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter, Charlotte, Jason, and Andrea. So this is pretty much the team that I turn to when I need advice for the board presentations that we probably do every month now, trying to get every week on the calendar. So great advice. Always good to have you, and thank you for the great work you do. So with that, we will say goodbye to our Australian friends and the honorary Australian for today, Andrea. And we'll see you again probably tomorrow. But please stay tuned online. We got our concluding session today, which is extremely important for the work that we do. I want to invite my colleague Leah McLean to talk about it. She's been part of this program from the get-go and helped us position CFF with the work that we do at SOFL and the DOL. And I think the most interesting and impressive part here is that we have a great divide between those that want to get in the jobs and those that are in the jobs, and getting the people that are in the jobs the help they need. And the apprenticeship model that the DOL is aggressively pursuing is an essential part of that. And we'll get to the nitty-gritties and details of that with the next panel. Of course, we have some representation from DOL as well. So thank you very much, and please welcome the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.